This is the war Ibadan never saw coming. A secret alliance was formed deep in the forest, and when it rose, it shattered the balance of Yoruba power forever. Subscribe to Folklore Frontier, where legends breathe and fear never sleeps. In the heart of Yorubaland, a sun was brewing, not in the sky, but in the minds and hearts of men. It was 1877, and Ibadan stood tall, a city of warriors, generals, and empire dreams. But beneath the ground, the roots of rebellions rest, far from the city's walls, in the dense forest where the cries of ox and the sounds of old gods still echoed. Something ancient was waking. The Yoruba people had never known a war like this, not because of its size, but because of its soul. This war was not for conquest, it was not for pride, it was for revenge, for redemption, and for something even deeper, memory. A memory of unity, of identity, and of resistance against domination. Ibadan, arrogant and blind in its confidence, did not see the threat coming, and when it did, it was too late. The Ekiti Parapo War was not a name, it was a movement, a storm cloaked in silence. And when it struck, it changed everything. Ibadan was no ordinary town. It was built by warriors, and by 1870, it had become a war machine. Conquering towns, collecting tributes, and making enemies. To understand why the Ekiti Parapo War ignited, we must understand Ibadan. Born in the ashes of the Oyo Empire's collapse, Ibadan rose as a phoenix, a place of refuge for warriors, hunters, and exiles. Its very foundation was steeped in battle. The people who founded Ibadan were not kings and scholars, they were fighters, men who had lost their homelands to Fulani invasions and internal betrayal, but from their pain they fought strength, and that strength became empire. By the mid-19th century, Ibadan was a military superpower of the Yoruba region. It was not just a city, it was a machine built for war. Its generals, known as Are Ono Kakanfo and Balogun, devised tactics that overwhelmed town after town. Ekiti, Ijesha, Akoko, Ondo, all were forced into tributary relationships, selling goods, soldiers, and loyalty to Ibadan. Ibadan grew rich on this system, but it also grew arrogant. Its commanders believed the other Yoruba groups had been broken, that they would never rise again, but they were wrong. Underneath Ibadan's shadow, resentment simmered like hot coals waiting for air, and soon those coals would catch fire. But the conquered were not broken. In the shadows, they united. The Ekiti, Ijesha, Akoko, and Igbomina, once divided, now gathered in secret. They called it the Ekiti Parapo. Resentment is a seed that grows best in silence, and for years, silence reigned across the eastern Yoruba towns. Ekiti men sharpened their cutlasses in the dark. Ijesha elders whispered stories of lost freedom. Akoko traders carried rumors between markets. Igbomina warriors buried their dead in shallow graves, waiting for vengeance. This resentment was not just about military conquest, it was about dignity. Ibadan's dominance meant the eastern Yoruba town could no longer speak freely in their own councils. Their youths were conscripted into battles they didn't choose. Their market women paid tribute under threat. Even sacred shrines were desecrated. Their priests humiliated. These were not just political offenses, they were spiritual wounds. Then, something unprecedented happened. They began to talk in secret groves, in hidden compounds, guarded by oaths and ancestral spirits. Emissaries met. These were not kings or emperors. They were hunters, blacksmiths, chiefs, priestesses, warriors. Each brought pain, each brought memory, and each brought a piece of the puzzle that would become the Ekiti Parapo, the Ekiti Confederacy. This alliance was more than military. It was spiritual. It was cultural. It was in many ways a restoration. For the first time in generations, the Eastern Yoruba began to see themselves not as fractured tribes, but as one force, one destiny. They agreed to keep the path hidden from Ibadan. No public declaration, no royal boast. Their movements were in the dark, sacred oaths taken under moonlight, messages sent in coded language, and warriors trained in silence. Their goal was not to destroy Ibadan, it was to balance power, to restore pride, and to reclaim agency over their own futures. They wanted to show that even the strongest warrior can bleed when truth is on the other side. And so the drums began to beat, quietly at first, then louder, until the ground shook. The Ekiti Parapo was not just a collation of towns, it was a heartbeat, the ancestral heartbeat of a people pushed too far. When that heartbeat aligned with gunpowder, steel, and divine rage, the war to come would be remembered forever. Then came the sound that changed everything. Kiriji, 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 named after the thunder of cannons. The war began, one of the longest and most brutal in Yoruba history. The forest was quiet until it wasn't. Then came the thunder, loud, relentless, echoing across the hills like a god's fury. The people call it Kiriji, the sound of the cannon fire that would define a generation. The first cannon shot weren't just signals of war, they were declarations. The Eastern Yoruba had risen. By 1877, the Ekiti Parapo launched a coordinated campaign. Immensely, the spiritual heart of the resistance became the headquarters. From there, warriors mobilized in waves. The British cannons they had acquired with the help of Yoruba diasporas, Sierra Leonean returnees, and trade links became symbols of their resolve. Ibadan responded with ferocity. The initial battles were fierce, brutal, and indecisive. Both sides knew each other too well. They spoke the same language, worshipped the same gods, and shared the same ancestors. But now they fought like strangers. Each battle took a toll. Villages were burnt, farmlands ravaged, sacred groves defied. The Kiriji War wasn't fought on one front, it was everywhere, in valleys, on hills, inside market squares, and across dense forests. Ibadan armies, though better organized, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer results and unpredictability of the Parapo warriors. This war was also a psychological war. Songs were sung to mock the enemy. Drums carried hidden messages. Oracles were consulted before every major move. The gods were involved. It was not just steel versus steel, but spirit versus spirit. Years passed and the war changed shape. It turned into attrition. Supply lines were disrupted. Allies shifted loyalties, and civilians suffered the most, but neither side would give up. The thunder of Kiriji roared on. But alliances can't last forever. Old rivalries resurfaced. The war dragged for 16 years until Britain stepped in, not to bring peace, but to prepare the land for colonial rule. Even the strongest rope can fray with time. After 16 long years of battle, cracks began to form within the Ekiti Parapo. What began as a united front started to swing under the weight of sacrifice and suffering. Different towns within the alliance had lost thousands of lives, and many began to question the end game. Old rivalries, once buried under the urgency of unity, began to re-emerge. Some factions accused others of holding resources, others whispered of betrayal, secret deals, conflicting loyalties, and weariness too deep for pride to carry. The Ibadan side was not faring much better. Its once indomitable armies were stretched thin. Supplies were hard to secure. Political foundations of the city-state began to crack as generals turned on one another, and morale plummeted. The world had become a ghost, haunting everyone but serving no one. Enter the British. For years, colonial officers and Christian missionaries had watched the war unfold. At first, they stayed back, watching the Yoruba state weaken each other. But eventually, trade was affected, roads were blocked, European economy interests began to suffer, and so they stepped in, not to heal wounds, but to prepare for conquest. In 1886, the British brokered what they called a peace treaty, but the war never truly stopped. Skirmishes continued for another 7 years. Only by 1893, when both sides were bled dry, did the guns fall silent. But that silence was deceptive. It wasn't peace, it was preparation. The end of the Kiriji War opened the gate for full British colonization. Once mighty Yoruba towns, exhausted from fratricide, now faced a new enemy, one with maps, treaties, and gunboats. Yet, the legacy of the Ekiti Parapo War lived on. It became a symbol of resistance, of sacrifice, and of what the Yoruba could do when united. Though the alliance collapsed, its memory did not. The war taught that true freedom cannot exist without unity, and that the greatest battles are not always won or lost on the battlefield, but in the hearts of the people who choose to remember. The Ekiti Parapo War was not just about land, it was about legacy. And though the guns are falling silent, the echoes of that war still shape Yoruba identity today. Subscribe to Folklore Frontier, where legends breathe and fear never sleeps.